If you are a wealthy family, you're going to pass away with a legacy. And they learn later in life about the realities of passing that on to someone being unprepared. And you are not spending time thinking through proper estate planning. You're missing gigantic opportunities. The deterioration of wealth through taxes and poor advice and not thinking proactively often drive at the passing of a generation even larger taxes. All of this conversation starting early, really helping your kids understand the work that you as parents have put into creating wealth is really important to start getting ingrained in their brains very early.
So hello, and thanks for joining us today for our NewEdge conversation about planning for the next generation and next-gen financial education. So I'm here with John Straus, one of our co-founders of NewEdge Wealth. John, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you wrote a neat white paper a few years ago about financial education, planning for the next generation. And it's something that we get asked about by our clients all the time, especially around when do I start having conversations and what the heck do I say? Can you kind of lead us off on the kind of the main themes that you see around this topic and you want to make sure that we cover today?
Yeah, I think the main themes are, there's been a pretty significant shift in the way that parents and families are starting to talk about wealth, generally speaking. I think from a generational shift, if you kind of go back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, talking about money with your kids was really a faux pas. No one did it. No one wanted to do it. And, there was that, scene in every movie where, a bunch of 60-year-olds were hanging around a lawyer's office learning what their parents said in their will. And I think today people have really learned from, we'll call them mistakes from the past of what kind of things that people have done that may not be the wisest moves. And they're starting to ask questions about how do they prevent certain things from happening as it relates to their kids. Going through that process for a lot of people was challenging. When people receive money without direction, I think there's been a lot of family rift. There have been challenges within discussions just generally about money and disagreement when nothing's been prepared. So we're getting a lot of questions from clients about what should they be doing, when should they be having those conversations, and how the hell do they actually do it?
You're making great points. And why do you think this is so important of a topic? Thematically, why is it such a big deal that we see gaps in this area?
I think the main point that most people don't really think about is that if you are a wealthy family, you're going to pass away with a legacy, a financial pile of capital. And unless you go bankrupt, it's almost a guarantee. And in most cases, that pool of capital is larger than people anticipate it being. And they learn later in life about the realities of passing that on to someone being unprepared. Also, I think because people have gone through it themselves, and we've seen generationally speaking, we had the baby boomers pass, sort of getting past wealth, and now they're a generation that's passing wealth on to the next generation. We're seeing this kind of like major movement. But, the old proverb of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, I think is a really powerful one. And there's a similar proverb for almost every single culture in humanity. So this is not a new concept, but just the concept that people are becoming aware of the challenges that come with managing significant wealth. It's a burden. It's a responsibility. It takes work. There's education. There's a knowledge set that just doesn't come to you. And you really do need to educate children to do that.
That's really important. And it's when you talk through about like the generational issue, right? Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. It's so true. And we see that so often where clients will also say, I don't want to tell them because I want them to have a work ethic and I want them to grow. And I don't want to tell them until they're kind of fully formed adults and have said work ethic, because if they know there's these piles of money over here behind the scenes, they will say, well, why bother have plenty? But it often seems like the failure to educate really just means that you've instilled ignorance in the children unintentionally, that I don't want it to be too soon and that it becomes too late. And so I think that's the most important part, is giving the next generation the skills they need in order to make an educated decision versus say, I don't know what I'm doing and I'm going to rely on someone else. And maybe that someone else is giving you bad advice. And then everything goes pear-shaped, as the English say. So I think you're making great points. So thematically, I think, we're speaking about that shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve issue of we want to get ahead of this, right? Because so often the generational wealth just goes away via multiple factors. And so what those are, and talking about how to start the conversation with the kids, right? When, what that looks like, and what structures can be put in place to help facilitate the ongoing education and conversations. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So where do you see the failures in, jumping into that first topic of where do you see the mistakes made, or where do you see the failures in getting this next gen up to speed?
I think one of the primary failures we see is thinking that you have to wait until your kids are out of college to start educating them. I think a lot of people want to see what their children become or who they become before they task them with, the education and the process of helping them understand this, what is a challenging concept for most people to deal with. And so, one of the things we talk about really frequently with clients is financial education is a education just like any other schooling, any other lessons you need to learn in life. This is not a conversation that you have once when your kids are 25 years old and hope that they take every piece of values and morals and everything else that you want and instill in what they're going to do. It starts really young. And I think some of the most successful families that we work with, they're not telling their 7-year-olds how much money they have, but they're being very deliberate in what they do with their children and how they interact with their children when it comes to money. I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old myself, and they see us spend money all the time. The quintessential question in our household is, can you buy that for me? And either it's a yes or a no. And that's pretty often, that's all they see as it relates to money. I go away in the morning and I come back at night. They've seen my office. They don't really know what I do here. So shame on me. But, recently my daughter asked to put a lemonade stand at the end of our street. And my wife took her to the grocery store, checked out a bunch of lemonade. And she asked my daughter if she had brought her money, and she said no. She said, well, how are you planning to pay for this? And I think it was this shock and awe that she was responsible for paying for the product that she wanted to sell. And then she was educated that she needed to buy cups and tablecloths and the paper for the sign and the tape and the ice. And she walked out of there spending $40 on lemonade and all the things you needed for it. And they were really successful. They sold $80 of lemonade, including a lot of big tips.
Impressive.
And her 3 friends then put their hands out and said, we're splitting this, right? Which she did. And she ended with $20. And that was my daughter's first lesson on what it takes to make money. And she realized that, you have to plan and think ahead. And I think a lot of this is all of this conversation starting early, really helping your kids understand the work that you as parents have put into creating wealth is really important to start getting ingrained in their brains very early.
That's exactly right. And those lessons that your daughter learned from doing that, it's both learning by doing, right? That's a big part of it, is learning by doing and seeing where the failures are as well as the successes. I mean, our brains in general, right, learn so much from what doesn't work. It's experimentation just as much from what does work. Like, okay, well, let's figure that out. Last time I ended up $20, but I put 40 in. Well, maybe I need to pay myself back for the upfront investment that I made into my business, right? Before splitting the profit after, and we know this, but of course, a child who's never done this before doesn't know this. And so it was an educational opportunity. It's a fantastic example. I love it. And it was age appropriate. And that's the other aspect, right, that you're speaking to, is not only the learning by doing, but an age appropriate example where you gave her some guidance, facilitated the conversation, and then she got to do something where she actually made money and saw the effort that it took to do that, right? Not just we go to work and come back, I sit in my office all day, and they're like, and my kids, I've told you this before, I think, but my younger child, as an example of what he thinks I do all day. And for those who don't know, I'm basically a tax and estate planning attorney by training, but not practicing here at NewEdge. I'm a wealth strategist, but I talk about people who have money, who have taxable estate problems. And my younger son, a couple of years ago, said, this is mom's job, blah, 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 rich people, blah, 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 taxes, blah, 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 rich people taxes. And I thought it was hilarious, but he's not really wrong, right? So it's just understanding what we do and how we make money and how we help people save their money for their family.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think we as parents often make a lot of assumptions around our children. One of them being that they understand what we do and the amount of energy that we put into what we do. You know, we have clients that have started companies, and the amount of blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into building that enterprise. It's almost impossible to show your children what you went through after the fact. So getting them intertwined into that stuff early, it's a paramount exercise to setting the stage for this conversation.
Absolutely. And putting and maybe giving examples around the dinner table or something like that, right? That obviously I'm not going to mention client names at home, but just, oh, I was working on X today or Y today, just to show effort, right? These things come up. And noting that we're constantly learning, it's that growth mindset as well as the fixed mindset, versus fixed mindset of we are still learning too, even though we're parents. And sometimes, at least when I get little, they think we know everything, but we make mistakes too, or we're still learning as well. So it sounds like, there's behavioral issues here, right? Meaning parents not initiating the conversation either at all or waiting a really long time. And I think we like to say that it's not really ever too late, right? Better to have the conversation today, even if you've never had it before, than to have no conversation ever. Just like you were giving that example of the people in their 60s sitting in, this hypothetical estate planning attorney's office, having the will read out loud, by the way, that never happens anymore. So you see that in books only. But yeah, it was a great example, right? Of it's never too late to start. Earlier is better. Preteen is probably ideal, age appropriate, and then just keep going. And that concept of drips versus fire hose, as you said, not one conversation, but to continue having multiple conversations. So a lot of it seems to be behavioral, that not having, only seeing the spending, not having conversations about wealth and not protecting them so they go into the world ignorant. What are the other things that are maybe less about the communication with the next gen, but other things that might lessen the family wealth or negatively impact it?
The things that drive the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves proverb are, number one, conversations with the next gen and making sure they're prepared. But more importantly, it is structural and it's taxation.
Yes.
If you are a wealthy family and you are not spending time thinking through proper estate planning, you're missing very frequently gigantic opportunities. And so by missing the structural planning opportunities, you're typically also missing out on tax planning opportunities. And the deterioration of wealth through taxes and poor advice and not thinking proactively often drive, at the passing of a generation, even larger taxes. And then the way I like to think about this is, if you had two people starting a family and they have 3 kids, you have a family of 5 surviving on a pool of capital. If each one of those 3 kids have 3 kids, and then they have kids, you might have a generation where there are 30 people pulling on the same pool of capital. In order for that money to not run out, it takes a lot of preparation, planning, and education to get everyone to understand what their roles are, responsibilities are, in making sure the money does last, if that is the goal.
Estate planning, as someone with a very large focus in estate planning, you're preaching to the choir, and I could not agree more. There, for those that aren't aware, the estate tax is, to the extent that you have a taxable estate, which in 2026 will be $15 million per person. Anything over that would be hit with a 40% tax. That's higher than the current top ordinary income tax rate. So to just chop off 40% of everything you have over a certain amount is a heck of a lot of money, to your point, right? And so if there are more people eating from the same bowl of whatever or pulling from the same pot, and there are fewer resources because you had to, at each generation, send a chunk to the government, the more planning you can do to strategize around that, it's very cost efficient, right? To do that planning and get those savings because, I mean, sometimes people say there's more than enough. I'll be dead. I won't care. And they're kind of jokingly saying, I mean, I've had clients say that. It's like, okay, but your family won't be. So can we maybe do a little planning for them? And so I'm really glad that you're bringing that up. Also, if it costs thousands to estate plan, and sometimes tens of thousands, depending on what you're doing, but you're saving millions, literally potentially millions, it's more than worth the investment for the family. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And then, similarly, right, there could be creditor issues, right? And that's why we do a lot of estate planning around keeping things in irrevocable trust down the road, prenups, things like that, because there's divorce too, right? As, we say creditor, but often that's a euphemism for future ex-spouses. Sometimes it is car accidents, other lawsuits, but often it is, marriages that don't work out. And so that can take a huge chunk of wealth away from the family line, whether they don't have, they have everything intermingled with the spouse or things were inherited and then put into a joint account and suddenly it's available, right? If people break up. So I think there are multiple ways the wealth could be diminished via external forces if good planning isn't in place, right?
Going back to the concept of running out of capital because you have so many people pulling on the capital. One of the challenges that we often see is families will say, okay, I have X amount of money. I'm going to spend no more than X percentage per year so I can maintain my lifestyle. Well, once you establish that lifestyle and you do have 3 children, multiply that spending by 3 because that is what will be required. Conversation needs to happen very early on this concept with your children to make sure they understand what the purpose of the capital actually is. Is it to maintain their lifestyles the same standard at which you created? Or is it meant to pay for their children's college? Without them knowing that information, they won't know that information. And, I often tell our the employees at our company, one very simple thing. And it's that if it's not said, it's never said. You can never point back to something and say, hey, this is what I was trying to intend. This was what we were trying to accomplish. The assumption that what you desire, the things that you want, that they are being picked up and understood by anybody, should never really occur.
Oh my gosh, yes. I don't think I've heard you say that before. And I would love it that if it's not said out loud or it's not written down, how the heck are they supposed to know? It's not like they magically live in your head and know. And we think, and often they do, right? Our actions speak louder than words, our body language, our tone, things can come across or modeling, right? Like you said about showing them how things are earned or maybe how we're budgeting or how we're giving to philanthropy, right? There's ways of modeling. But again, if you don't also, belt and suspenders, if you don't put it together with saying out loud, this is important to me. This is why we're doing this. And especially around those topics of like some clients who say, I want to have $1 left when I'm gone. I want to have, a big credit card bill when I kick it. And I want to spend every last dollar. And I laugh because it is funny, but also, well, hey, because we can't plan exactly when we're going to leave. That's sort of a risky proposition, right? We have to make sure you're going to have enough for that last dollar so that you actually can spend it. So that idea of lifestyle, especially as you make more, you tend to spend more, and then your lifestyle improves, and it's very hard to go the other way, right? So I love that you're making that point of, is this about a lifestyle sustainability, or is this intergenerational wealth sustainability, in which case you have to make sure that every generation is not spending so much that it's depleting the principal to an unsustainable amount, right?
I actually think, an important point to make is in our seat, we often make the assumption that families want their wealth to last as long as it possibly can. But often that's not the case. We see situations where families want to give away, a substantial amount of their money to charity. Or, we've had situations where families are just so extraordinarily successful that they actually feel like it's such a burden on the next generation that they don't want the next generation to really be able to access it. And all of those desires and goals are right. There's no wrong way of doing this, but if you don't talk about this with your children and they expect to receive a huge inheritance and find out after the fact that it's going to charity, that can create some major angst. And so that conversation is super important.
That's very true. And we've talked about, and you touched on it, but I don't know that we said it quite so explicitly, of having professional guidance, right? That, you did speak to it, but we can't all be the jack of all trades, right? None of us is able to be an expert in every area of everything. So it's great to have people who can help you with this, help the parents with this in this next generation, of having someone involved, participatory. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely seen this with my own children, that sometimes when mommy and daddy, my kids are a bit older, but like when mommy and daddy say something and they say, whatever, mom, and we get that kind of attitude because we're the parent, but sometimes having that third party who is an expert in the field, or this is what they do professionally, it bears more weight, right? They're less likely to be ignored because of their role.
I always tell people we can play many roles. We can play good guy, we can play bad guy. But more importantly, we're not parents to our clients. And so we can often be even just a sounding board for questions that they feel like, hey, I want to know how much money is in my trust. They want to ask questions. They don't know how to ask those questions. We can be a sounding board, not answering the question, but helping them understand maybe why they aren't being told, or a better way to ask the question to their parents that maybe they can get some feedback or answers. But I think even more importantly, we talk about, as parents, we need to model good behavior and set an example for our children. I would guess that our most successful clients are also those that are good at soliciting feedback and receiving advice and doing something with it. Everyone has people around them that feel like they know it all and never really want to hear advice. And my view of the world is that there are people that need advice and want it, and that there are people who need advice and don't want it. Most successful people are the people that do want it. And I think it's really important that you show to your children, in order to become successful, you do need to have other smart people around you to help guide you to make good decisions. A lot of people make decisions on their own. They do research, they go through a process, and then they hope that the thing they did is the right decision. But you're never going to be as educated as the person or the people around you that are making that decision on a regular basis and advising on those decisions constantly.
It's the experience question, right? And the what do you think question, right? And then actually listening to and absorbing the answer, right? You're right that those who always need to be the smartest person in the room. I mean, hey, I like being the smartest person in the room and all, but then you're in an echo chamber, and that may not actually help you find insights to look around corners. You're exactly right. And having people who do this every day, all day, they will probably know more about the area than this particular person for this particular topic and can help out, right? Because we see that those who are very affluent, at some point, time becomes more valuable than money. And for clients who are very wealthy and need assistance in this area and are saying, I want to spend my time in other ways. I don't want to be managing everything myself. I don't, getting in outside resources to help with this can be very, very helpful. I did want to point out one more thing, topic switch within, but like one more thing to make sure we don't miss it, and then confirm with you, like, am I missing anything else? But I think you and I had a couple of chats about when doing things like estate planning, whether it's making sure your 18-year-old has their own documents done, they're heading off to college, if they're going to college, and making sure that they have the basics like the power of attorney, if they need help with bill paying, or get, in the hospital for some reason, that you have healthcare power of attorney, those kinds of things. Because when they're 18, you don't automatically get the right to see everything anymore. So, things like that. But we also talked about not just that estate planning saves you money for intergenerational wealth, but also estate planning around what are the right structures, which might be what type of trust and any kind of alphabet soup acronym that's there. But you and I had talked about equitable versus fair, or like equal versus fair, or equal versus equitable. And maybe that's not always the same thing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think I've said it to almost every client. The word fair is nothing but a 4-letter word. It is very hard to be fair when it comes to estate planning, intergenerational wealth transfer. Perspectives on this are forever going to be different and very hard to align. And we always talk about, the what if. Typically people do their first round of estate planning when they have kids, and it's very hard to envision what your yes. child's going to be, who they're going to be, what they're going to be like 25 years from now, what kind of career they're going to have. But inevitably, one of your children, if you have two, is going to be more successful than the other. And it is not insane or it is not wild to have a situation where one of your children are far more successful than you. And when you are considering estate planning and you're considering equitable distribution, what is fair very likely is not equal dollars across children. We have situations where you have a child that starts a very successful company while they're young, does very well, becomes extraordinarily successful. Everyone in the family gets along very well, and their other child is a teacher. Noble profession. Everyone knows teachers do not get paid nearly enough money in this country, but passing the same amount of wealth to both of those children can be perceived as unequal. In addition, if you have successful children, passing large sums of wealth to your children outright can actually be a very inefficient way of passing wealth to the next generation. Having them in a situation where they have to pay estate taxes on assets where they otherwise wouldn't have to pay estate taxes is something you should be coordinating, and something we're often talking to clients about later in the lives of their parents. We're trying to coordinate conversations with their parents' estate attorneys to ensure that they don't receive inheritances outright. All of this is just to say that anything that you choose to do, whether it's passing all your assets down to your children equally, in single pot trusts for them, in separate trusts, unequal distribution, giving money to charity, whatever it is, you need to have conversations with your children in advance to make sure they understand why you are making the choice to do whatever you are doing. Because otherwise, they're left with a nagging question, which is, why did he do it this way? Why did she do it this way? There's so many questions that come up, and that's where family rift and chasms get created within siblings when money passes from one generation to the next without any conversation. I always say, wealth without any discussion is just money. And a plan without any discussion is just a document. You have to talk about all of these things in order for them to make sense and to make sure that they don't create the rifts that we've seen so many families experience.
Context is everything. And to factor in the family's personal context and situation, what each child is like, whether they're spendthrifts, as we call them, people who just, spend like there's a hole in the pocket, someone who is, very financially successful, like you said, fantastic job, but maybe doesn't make as much money, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about customization, and it is not one size fits all. I think those are both things that relate to what you were just speaking about. I think the last thing, and this relates to that, is, values, right? Because what we're really saying is, what are you trying to instill? What are your values? Does your plan, whether it's the way you manage the money or hire someone to manage the money, whether it's how you set up your estate plan, whether it's the comments you put in your plan or the conversations you've had or the giving that you do philanthropically, all of this is a portrayal of your values, and does it match with what you wanted to intend? Does it all work together? And saying, doing that more proactively in the next generation educational process so that it does at least explain the values, even if the kids don't necessarily absorb it immediately. Drip, 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 get there and make sure it's clear. What, if anything, have I missed during this conversation? I think we covered a lot of really awesome grounds, and this has been enjoyable.
Well, I think just one thing I want to touch on values is there's often a lot of missing context when we use the term values. Values are formed through experiences. And if you live your life and you form a bunch of values or ways you want to live your life or things you believe in, when you tell anybody what your values are without the context of why those values exist. They're opinions. And people's opinions often differ. Therefore, their values will often differ. And their opinions are often formed because they have values formed by experiences. And so one of the most challenging things we actually see a lot of families face is converting parental values to family values. And what the parents want is not always what the kids want. And making sure that the kids are in a position to understand why those values are in place, but also make sure that parents understand the value systems that their kids have created, which in most cases are drastically different.
You're not wrong. Yes.
And if you are asking your children to do things that go against their value system, you need to be aware of that earlier in the conversation. And that's actually a huge part of the work we do, is helping families understand what those value systems are across the family so that we can start to have conversations that integrate those differing value systems rather than projecting one set of values onto the entire family.
Yes. And if the more that the family can be collaborative and the kids buy in, it's not like you said, it's, not just imposing the values upon them, right? But being integrated. And I've mentioned a philanthropy kind of off the cuff a couple of times, but, an example of that might be, hey, you give X dollars to the kids, right? And say, we're going to have a family meeting. I want you to think about where you want to give the money. It's our money, but I'll let you pick where it goes, right? And then they're invested. Or I think I remember reading in a next gen education book once, and I don't recall which one, but it was talking about shared resources. And, you were saying that, the parents' values may not necessarily be the same as the children's values, especially if the modeling isn't, indicative of that. But that idea of rowing in the same direction, if you have finite resources and you have to discuss amongst yourselves, how do we allocate these finite resources? And that might be, the hypothetical could be 1 or 2 cars, but 4 people need to go places. Mom and dad have a job, and kid 1 has football practice, and kid 2 has a part-time job, or whatever happens to be. And who is driving someone else? Who gets the car? What's the stack ranking of priorities? Because even when there's lots of money, it is technically still a finite resource. And if you spend $2 million a year, even if you have $100 million, that may not be enough, right? So it's all relative. And the more the family can be involved so that they do feel more invested. And that, I think, is the best way to get that intergenerational continuity of values as well.
One of the scariest things that parents often face as it relates to wealth, legacy, and children is that the world will consider your children adults before you consider your children adults.
Wow. Yeah.
The requirement of education prior to becoming an adult, prior to them having to actually have health documents and legal documents, opening accounts, not being able to do things with mom and dad all the time, they become adults pretty quickly. At 18, the world says that your child is a full-fledged adult. The challenge with that is because we often don't see them as adults at 18, and I'd say in most cases, kids are living at home until they're 25. At this point, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard for a lot of families.
Don't jinx us.
Yeah,
but yes,
to detach themselves from that. You do need to recognize that the reason why we always say earlier is better is because that adulthood moment occurs much more rapidly than most people anticipate, and the procrastination of these conversations often leads to a rushed set of conversations, which is far more difficult.
Yeah, great point. I have an 18-year-old who just left for college, and I think he said something a few weeks before he left. It was something like, my free trial has ended, and now it's real adulting, which I loved that. It was just, it matters now, right? If you make a mistake now, the law assumes that you're an adult, you're a grown-up, and you need to be responsible. But they're like all of us, they're still in transition. And they still need guidance, and we just hope they appreciate it. But you're making a great point, and I'm glad you brought that last one up, is that it's better to have the conversation than not have the conversation, and it's an ongoing process.
And you will be shocked when you call up your child's university or college asking for information because they got hurt or you want to get access to their grades, and they tell you no because they didn't authorize it. Those are the things that I think really shock people. But they're things that you can plan for. They're things that, having your children having relationships with your advisors can really help in those situations to make sure that they are getting advice on the things that they need. But also, this is where it's a great opportunity to start having bigger conversations, because it starts to put things into a similar bucket into the stuff that you're dealing with. When you start talking about estate planning, well, why do you need a will at 18? Why do you need power of attorney at 18? Well, let me talk you through what I did and why I did it. And I think it can be a really powerful way to integrate that conversation as something that they start to understand.
Very true. Very true. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I feel like we could go on all day because it's such an important topic, but I'm glad we covered it. There is a white paper that John has written about this exact topic. So feel free to go to our website and grab it. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Anneke.